Berzerk was released as an arcade game by Stern Electronics in 1980, and was ported to the Atari 2600 and released by Atari in August of 1982. With the exception of the lack of the arcade's voice synthesis and simplified level design, the Atari port of Berzerk is remarkably faithful to the original. You play as a human trapped in a maze full of robots who want you dead. Though you're outnumbered, the robots lack the ability to fire diagonally, and start out with the AI of a toaster. As you gain points, the robots become more difficult to deal with, but that's okay because you can escape to the next screen even if the robots aren't destroyed. If you take too long on any given screen, Evil Otto will show up to ruin your day. He's indestructible, but on one game setting on the Atari, shooting him makes him vanish for a few seconds. He can move faster than you vertically but can only match your speed horizontally, so if you see Otto, be sure to run right or left, not up or down. On a scale of 1 to 10, this game gets a 9. It's not the best game ever, but it's pretty close. If you're new to the Atari 2600, pick up Berzerk. You can buy it for less than $5 online. I'm the Dork with no name, and I'll see you tomorrow for day 2 of this marathon. Some games are called classics because they redefined what it means to be a game. Some because they're so influential, some because they're just fun, and some games are classics because of a gimmick. In my opinion, that's the case with Battlezone. Released in 1980 by Atari, a large part of Battlezone's draw was the unusual periscope screen and dual joystick controls of the arcade cabinet. In 1983, Atari ported the game to the Atari 2600, and though the game was changed considerably, the end result was a superior game. Instead of monochromatic vector graphics, the game has colorful raster graphics and places the player behind rather than inside of the tank. The objects in this game are blocky, but well defined. Tanks, UFOs, and what's apparently a Romulan warship. Battlezone's been cloned at least once on the Atari. Robot Tank is Activision's clone and features more arcade-like controls in Battlezone, time of day changes, variable weather conditions that influence how your tank moves, and much easier gaming experiences. In this instance, the original is a superior game, so go buy a copy. I'm the Dork with no name, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next game in this marathon. How many Atari games were so scary that they gave their programmers nightmares? To my knowledge, 1. Missile Command. Released to the arcades by Atari in 1980, and ported to the Atari 2600 in 1981, Missile Command is the manifestation of Cold War-era paranoia into one of the greatest video games ever made. So great were the concerns of real-life nuclear attack, and so engaging was the game, that programmer David Thurler had reoccurring nightmares about nearby cities being bombed. Missile Command on the Atari 2600 is a fantastic port of the arcade original with one exception. The game doesn't support the Atari trackball controller. This doesn't make sense, but fortunately a loyal fan recently remedied the situation by releasing a hacked version of the game reprogrammed to use the trackball controller. Missile Command was one of the most popular and influential arcade games of its time, and if the trackball controller worked, it would have been one of the very best of the Atari 2600. I'm the Dork with no name, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next game in this marathon. November of 1979 will forever be remembered as the month when Asteroids took over the world. Released by Atari, Asteroids along with Lunar Lander became one of the first 2 games ever registered to the Copyright Office, and was so popular a sequel came out the following year. Eventually, the game was ported onto the Atari 2600. The 2600 version replaces the iconic vector graphics with colorful raster graphics, but due to flicker issues, your ship can be hard to see sometimes. Asteroids was the first game to introduce physics into video games, meaning that your ship and the asteroids both have inertia. By using the difficulty and game select switches on your Atari, there are 66 game variations, changing the number of asteroids, the force field, the number of UFOs, and the speed of your ship. Though it's a classic, and for good reason, the repetitive gameplay doesn't hold up as well as the repetitive gameplay of other games, but it's still good. Good, but not great. I'm the Dork with no name, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next game in this marathon. You might ask yourself what would happen if Lunar Lander and Asteroids had a crazy hybrid love child. The answer, as the world discovered in 1982, was Gravitar, released by Atari. In 1983, Gravitar found its way onto the Atari 2600. The game combines the inertia of asteroids and the gravity of Lunar Lander into one of the most underappreciated games ever to be shown in flickering raster graphics. You fly around a planetary system looking for trouble. When you enter a planet's orbit, you're tasked with destroying all of the bunkers on the planet without crashing. As you do this, you burn fuel, so you also need to pick up fuel tanks from the planet's surface. Once all of the bunkers on a planet are destroyed, you can move on to ruin more lives on other planets. Due to a steep learning curve, this game never really caught on, but in recent years, hardcore retro gamers are finally giving it the audience it's always deserved. Do yourself a favor, pick up this game. Love it. I'm the Dork with No Name, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next game in this marathon. In 1978, after a year of designing graphics and gameplay, programming, and even designing and building the hardware needed to develop and play the game, Tomohiro Nishikado completed the game that would reinvent video games and alter the course of all electronic interactive entertainment: Space Invaders. The important thing to realize is that Tomohiro Nishikado created the entire game by himself, even the hardware. As he once put it, it was a very difficult process. The hardest part was the development of the microcomputer. Microcomputers were hardly used at that time in Japan, so we had to create one from scratch. I could almost say developing the microcomputer was harder than developing the game itself. These days, we have personal computers to rely on, but there was no programming environment back then. So, I had to create everything by myself. I created a development device, wrote a part of the game that runs on it, and then created more devices along the way. Space Invaders was one of the first shooters, so even the concept of shooting at something was relatively new back then. Even coming up with the iconic alien ships was a tricky task. According to Nishikado, it was not an easy job. First I thought of making tanks or airplanes as the targets to shoot, but it was technically hard to make the airplanes look like they were actually flying. Human movement would have been easier, but I felt it would be immoral to shoot humans, even if they were bad guys. Then I heard about a movie called Star Wars released in the US, which was coming to Japan next year, so I came up with a game based in space, which had space aliens as targets. Ported onto the Atari 2600 in 1980, this is the game that saved the system. Even though there were other arcade ports for home game consoles, none were this good. Anything else I say is going to be fanboy gushing, so I'll put it this way. I even have a Space Invaders ice cube tray. I'm the Dork with No Name, and I'll be back next time for the last game in this marathon. If you ask yourself which Atari game has the coolest box art, the answer is simple: Phoenix. Originally released to the arcades in 1980, Phoenix was one of the first full-color arcade games, and one of the earliest games in which there was a boss battle. Ported to the Atari 2600 in 1982, Phoenix is a rarity. It's a top-down space shooter that I actually enjoy. Considered one of the more accurate arcade ports of the time, the 2600 version lacks the music of the arcade game, and while the arcade game is set in space, in the Atari version it looks like you're crawling along the ground. Despite this game kicks an unparalleled quantity of alien ass, or the target of your choice. It's up to you. In the first two waves you fight kamikaze birds, and in the next two, you fight birds who can regrow lost wings. The fifth wave is the Phoenix Mothership, and while it's somewhat disappointing that it doesn't have the guardian birds of the arcade game, it's still great. If you haven't played this game, shame on you. Go buy it. It costs $2 these days. I'm the Dork with No Name, and I obsess over trivial matters.